While they had garnered a certain esoteric infamy over the years through hip hop and meme culture, until recently, modern hood scammers remain mostly figures of lore and caricature to the uninitiated. But the recent rollout of exotic and exoteric tales of DIY wealth reallocation schemes has brought the breath of the industrially scaled scam economy out from the margins and into the mainstream, setting the stage for something major. The top-down ripple effect of scamming on Wall Street has been well documented and narrated. But what happens when that same predatory philosophy permeates the social pyramid and ripples its way back up, so to speak? We hit the town to unpack the phenomenon while begging the question, can street-level scammers shovel enough shit back up the ladder for the top 1% to smell it? And could hip-hop's shameless celebration of scamming be able to achieve what centuries of scandal have failed to do and critically eroding public confidence in the banks?
It all flows back to the central bank. So the central bank in America essentially prints money, and that money has no accountability or no ways to um, check to see whether or not it's having a positive economic impact. The opposite is true. For example, in 2008, when Wall Street made a ton of mistakes and those banks went bankrupt and they were caught committing massive fraud, like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, yes. The Federal Reserve Bank, the source of the money printing, just wrote checks and said, try to do better next time. There's no rule of law. We're not going to prosecute you for the fraud that you admittedly commit. We're just going to keep printing money, printing money, printing money. So that's the center of this wealth and income gap and this destruction of the middle class. It all goes back to the central bank. That's the source of the imbalances and the injustices in the United States, in my view, and you can see it all over the world. The primary business of Wall Street is fraud. And it's fraud that this is the business model of Wall Street. They keep 90 cents of every fraudulent dollar they make, and then they have to pay 10 cents as a fine. Wow. So for every dollar of fraud Wall Street commits, they have to pay 10 cents as a fine. They get to keep 90 cents. That's the business model of Wall Street.
Historically, the big banks have always been seen as the gatekeepers of the status quo, and therefore naturally difficult targets reserved for only the bravest or most desperate. But the current paradigm of digital finance provides a smooth thoroughfare for all types of grand larceny, albeit by different names like identity theft or quantitative easing. And while the too big to fail or jail banksters would have no doubt set the trend toward disillusionment with the economy and the law, legitimizing white-collar crime and trickling down their singular secure-the-bag ethic, if nothing else, pulling funny money out of thin air has caught on as a business model.
I think with people, scamming, I guess now from a social media perspective has become popular, but scamming has been around since America started. And people of all races have been participating in scamming for years. I've represented people now over the course of almost 20 years. And there are people I know who that was the choice of crime that they were participating in from back then. It just wasn't popular. You also didn't have the vehicle to make it popular. People weren't rhyming about it. But it is a phenomenon in our community. I mean, listen, every day, Wall Street is the biggest crime scene in America. Does the Attorney General on the local level in New York, does the Department of Justice hone in on those guys? They do sometimes, but their focus isn't on those guys. This is just not. Why? Because if they were to do that, if they was to put Wall Street under a microscope, what they would uncover would disrupt the natural order of things in this society. Because when you follow the money and when you follow the relationships, it emerges into the legal world, and they would never do that. But I've represented plenty federal cases where the federal defendant is charged with a scam or a scheme much less than what Bernie Madoff was charged with. But when that young man or young woman goes before a judge, the focus on them to remain and be detained is very high. They won't get a bail. Bernie Madoff got a bail. Paul Manafort got a bail. The only reason his bail was revoked because he was intimidating a witness. So clearly, you know, there's a distinction. So clearly, the system treats people of color involved in scams differently than they do white Americans. You could pull the cases from the Second Circuit and see it for yourself, but no one talks about it. You know, if your wealth isn't focused on building up your community, if you don't have an infrastructure, social, familial, institutional system set up to produce leaders, to educate kids, to give them their value system, then you're always going to have these kids relying on entertainment as their default value system. And if they're listening to the music, if they're watching that television, if they listen to all of these distractions, they're going to be curious. They don't know the result of their curiosity, though, and they're not comfortable when they're caught, and they're not prepared when they're caught. So my advice would be to educate them as to, you know, listen, if you sometimes in taking a shortcut, you extend more energy than you would do if you just went the direct route. And unfortunately, entertainment, crime and street culture and prison culture and criminal culture, it's all dysfunction. But how is it that in our community, after the transatlantic slave trade, after thousands of us, millions of us killed, murdered, marginalized, terrorized, alienated, discriminated against, how is it that we live in a society where the majority of our kids want to be entertainers as street guys? That doesn't make any sense. That's a purposive thing that's built, and that's a typical way. Now, is that the only way? Absolutely, of course not. There are guys who are very sophisticated, very bright, who their form of scamming is totally different. So it's much harder to catch them in certain regards. But does the government know about those scams? Absolutely, because in this day and age of technology, in this day and age of mandatory minimums, in this day and age of no one really wants to go to jail, you're going to cultivate cooperators and informants. So even if they don't know the particular details, eventually they will. And the mandatory minimums that are involved with drugs are just very, very high. It's not worth it, you know. So, but scamming has replaced that in a certain degree, because anyone and everyone can get involved. The nerdy kid and his friends can get involved with it. The flashy kids, the goon kids, everybody can get involved in it. And depending on who gets involved with it, depends on where that money goes. You know, that money could be the source of the gang when they need to buy guns. That money could be the source of the gang or a group of people when they need to buy drugs. And what our young men and women don't understand is that the way that white American jurisprudence looks at us, they look at us as objects. So when you live in 10A, your man lives in 10B, your cousin lives around a corner in 11C, y'all just know each other. Y'all may get money together sometime. Y'all mostly hang out together, but y'all may know one guy who sources the cars, or y'all may have one connect who provides the drugs. The federal government is looking at that as an enterprise. The neighborhood is an enterprise. So you're going to end up with a racketeering RICO charge. You ain't got no money. You ain't got no cars. You don't got a pile of bodies like the mob did, where the mob got to be afforded and people romanticize about organized crime. Meanwhile, these sociopaths kill hundreds of people. Very few of them ever face the death penalty. However, crime has changed. The mob and white organized crime groups don't have the microscope that people of color have on them, and they've been able to transition into the legal world. not so much for young black and brown kids. So the statute that was created for kingpins and killers and white organized crime groups is now being applied to kids who just, some doing it for shits and giggles. Some of them doing it to survive, but it's being applied to them. And that's the state of law enforcement right now. When you go to the federal docket and you look at the arraignment, you see tons of kids coming through this system in these huge sweeps where technology and that intel is all focused on certain projects, certain areas, and they're sweeping them off the street. And they're cleaning these communities out. And it's loosely tied into gentrification. And that's the state of America.
We found, as is often the case, many of the youth in the ghettos have found themselves well ahead of the times and actually represent some of the earliest adopters of digital currency and have been using Bitcoin on an almost daily basis for years already, long before the massive speculators or institutions got here. Some have even hodled their way right out of poverty.
Where are the Bitcoin ATMs at? You see them on Wall Street? You see them on the Upper East Side? On the Upper West Side? You find them in the bodegas in the hood. Why? Because they know. Yeah, exactly. It's a dirty game. And those bodega guys know it's better than the ATM. They make more money off that than they do on the ATM. That's where you find all of these Bitcoin machines at. Ridiculous. People doing that, the unemployment scam and the business loan scam. Like, those two are like the hot commodities right now. Like, people don't even have the business loans. They don't even have a business for a loan. And they're applying for the loan and they're getting it. So you can get them in. Like, I know a couple of rappers that did it and they used their money on buying a Lamborghini. It's like, bro, are you crazy? For the young kids, a lot of them are doing like the mailbox fishing, where like they'll go to a mailbox, they'll stick like a glue trap on a shoestring, they'll still put it in the mailbox, and then they'll like get the checks. So what the checks is, they wash them. Once they wash them, then they'll put their own name out, make it to themselves. You can go into one of these little rinky-dinky check cashing places. It's the new drug game, man. So guys that normally were selling drugs back in the day, they realized that you could do less crime, you do less time and make more money. But the rules still apply the same way as they would in the drug game. So a lot of these people that's getting shot and killed is because they were either quote unquote zold, robbed. You don't really hear about guys doing home invasions like they used to because nobody's really keeping his own product. No. And, when they do it, it's mainly cash, or they're doing it to like these underground betting sites. Your lifeline is cooperation. Like, in order to be a good, I don't care what nobody tell you, in order to be a good investigator, you need people, you need to lean on the people in the community, because if not, if nobody tells you shit, you have nothing. But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people, when they get their first interaction with cops and they get questioned, they get nervous. And then they start telling on everybody. They're like, yo. Best advice I would give young scammers, old scammers, all scammers, keep your ass off of social media. If you gonna scam, right, keep your ass off of social media. It's the best time to do it. If you're gonna do it, you might as well do it now. Because nobody prosecuting anybody with a mask on. So if you're gonna do it, you better do it now.
But one of the biggest concerns surrounding the hip-hop generation's recent foray into financial crimes traditionally dominated by highly organized crime has been the question of outright heat. Scammers in the city have a notorious reputation for being far too transparent, and the daily blotters are littered with sweeping conspiracy indictments, as big as 120 arrests being leveled against scamming gangs where investigators build cases largely off of published social media. You'd hardly have to have your ears to the streets these days to know that there's already a hostile run on the banks taking place on the underground, and according to the data, it's due to break ground any day now. Data is arguably the most coveted commodity in the world, and its systematic mismanagement is at the root of the industrially scaled scam economy. The endless streams of personal data we both willingly and unwittingly provide to large corporations like banks end up settling in centralized servers which are almost inevitably and invariably hacked, giving bad actors direct access to personal information and even funds. But the birth of the Bitcoin blockchain represented a pivot away from not only the centralized financial paradigm which facilitated fraud as a business model, but potentially flipping the entire script away from corruptible systems of centralized power at large towards an age of decentralization and freedom. There isn't much doubt left that Bitcoin is here to stay with us and is poised to become a cornerstone of the global economy, with mainstream adoption already underway and a market cap climbing quickly into the trillions. A decentralized, unconfiscatable hard money likened to digital gold, but the likes of which have really never been seen before, with the potential to build sovereign generational wealth for early adopters and effectively disrupt the status.
This is the ultimate emancipation. Okay, the slave business never ended in America because you went from slavery to Jim Crow. Then from Jim Crow, you went to the prison industrial complex, which is 80% the black population, and they've now made labor in prison legal. It used to be illegal. So slavery is bad. Slavery is legal in America, and it's mostly hitting black community, right? So the adoption of hard money and individual sovereignty is a path for emancipation, outside of the control of whitey. The American political narrative as white supremacy. And if you want to look at it in those terms, it's hard to argue. We're still living in a white supremacist kind of political system. And the way out of that is with hard money and individual sovereignty. To have your own, to be able to transact without being intermediated upon, to have, communities that are supportive, without having outside intermediaries come in and do what we know they do, man. That's the history. As more people in government realize the power of Bitcoin, the alarm bells are going off, and they're starting, what should we do now against this threat? And then now we're getting into a new era of I guess you could call it a conflict between the state and Bitcoin. I guess in the hip hop community, you listen to what's happening in the zeitgeist, in the cultural milieu, and you hear it out there that